At family dinner, my brother sneered, "Where you live, that's barely a house." My dad laughed, and in that moment something inside me quietly shattered, but not in the way they expected. Because what they didn't know was that I had built something far greater than a house. I had built a life. And tonight you'll hear how one forgotten son rewrote his entire story, not for revenge, but for redemption. Stay with me, this isn't just a story of success. It's a lesson in quiet strength that just might change the way you see your own worth. The chandelier above glinted like a constellation suspended in crystal. Around the long mahogany table, the Brennan family had gathered in their familiar formation, Cole at the head, flanked by his wife and their two children, Margaret and Richard across from them, and Lucas as usual seated at the far end as though he were a guest rather than a son. Margaret's birthday had always been a production. She liked appearances, upscale locations, polished silverware, the illusion of closeness. Lucas had flown in from his quiet corner of Denver, the same studio apartment he'd occupied for the past 5 years, just to show he remembered. But he could already sense the undercurrent mockery wrapped in smiles. As the waiter poured wine, Cole leaned back and turned to Lucas, his voice loud enough for the table to hush. "So, Lucas, that apartment of yours still holding up? I mean, what's it, 600 square feet? That's barely a house." A few stifled laughs. Richard chuckled openly, shaking his head with mock pity. Margaret avoided eye contact, pretending to adjust her necklace. Lucas simply lifted his glass, swirling the wine before taking a sip. The silence that followed buzzed louder than the insult itself. Cole wasn't done. "I mean, you're what, mid-30s now? Don't you think it's time to start living like an adult?" Lucas set his glass down carefully, the stem clinking gently against the base. He didn't answer. Not immediately. He wasn't surprised. He'd lived through this tone of voice, this disdain wrapped in casual arrogance his entire life. Growing up, he'd always been the sensitive one, the dreamer, the quiet kid who preferred books to baseball. Cole, older by 4 years, had been the golden boy captain of everything, top of his class, the kind of son Richard could show off. Lucas was a good kid, sure, but not the kind of child his father boasted about to co-workers. He was the one they left off the family newsletters. The afterthought. He used to try. God, he had tried. For years he brought report cards home with trembling hands, hoping this time an A in biology might earn more than a distracted nod. But all he ever got was, "You still planning on doing that science stuff? You know that doesn't pay right." Margaret, more subtle than her husband, never criticized outright. Her disapproval came in the form of suggestions. "Maybe finance is more stable, sweetie. Cole could get you a job at the firm. It's just, we want what's best for you." Lucas had learned to smile and nod, to shrink into the spaces they left for him. But not tonight. Tonight the air smelled of rosemary, lamb, and betrayal. The menu was upscale, the conversation not so much. "I'm glad you're still doing your thing," Cole said now, stabbing his fork into a steak. "Seriously, it's admirable keeping at it all these years." Lucas glanced at his mother. She was still pretending the floral centerpiece demanded her full attention. Sophie, his younger sister, offered a sympathetic look but said nothing. She never did. Richard chuckled again, wiping his mouth. "As long as you're happy, son, that's what matters, right?" The word son hit with a dull thud. It always sounded different when Richard said it to Lucas, not with the pride he used for Cole, but with a kind of vague obligation, like he was reminding himself. Lucas inhaled slowly. "Yeah, I am happy." A few raised brows. "I've got a good life," he added, his voice calm. "I may not have the square footage, but I've got enough space to think. And to sleep at night. That's more than I can say for some." Cole raised an eyebrow. Was that a dig? Lucas smiled politely. Just a reflection. Silence again, the kind that begged to be filled with small talk, but no one dared. Margaret finally clinked her glass. Let's toast to family. Lucas raised his, though he didn't feel like toasting. He scanned the faces around him, smiling tight, rehearsed. People who shared his blood but not his heart. This wasn't a dinner, it was a rerun, and yet something had shifted. A crack subtle and seismic. He wasn't the same Lucas they remembered. He wasn't here to win points or fit in anymore. He was here to mark the end of something. When the evening finally wound down and everyone rose to leave, Lucas stayed seated a moment longer, eyes lingering on the melting candle. They wouldn't ask what he'd been working on. They wouldn't know the name of his company or the breakthroughs he'd helped pioneer or the lives his research touched. To them, he was still the quiet one, the underachiever, the kid who hadn't quite figured it out. That was fine. He didn't need them to clap. He needed them to see. As he stepped out into the cold Denver air, Lucas zipped up his coat and walked to his car alone. No one offered a ride. No one called out. It was fitting. He started the engine, his fingers trembling, not from the cold, but from something deeper. Not anger, not sadness, resolve. It's time they saw who I really am. Not because I want to be loved, but because I refuse to be dismissed. Lucas used to think silence was safety. As a child, he learned to disappear in plain sight, tucked into the corner of the family room with a book about the stars or crouched on the porch watching ants organize their colonies. He was the type of boy who asked too many questions about things that couldn't be measured in touchdowns or Sims figures. Questions like, why do leaves turn red? How does DNA store memory? Where does loneliness come from? Richard, his father, had little patience for such musings. Don't be weird, son, he'd say, flipping the newspaper. No girl wants to marry a walking encyclopedia. At 8 years old, Lucas began to hide his curiosity. He learned that excitement about science made people frown, that talking about genetics over dinner was not appropriate, that being fascinated by mitochondria earned eye rolls, not praise. Cole, meanwhile, was everything Lucas wasn't and everything Richard valued. Captain of the baseball team by age 12, president of the student council by 14, and accepted into Stanford business by 18. He filled every room with his voice. His laugh was the soundtrack of every family event. Look at that form, Richard would beam at one of Cole's baseball games. Lucas had watched from the stands, a book tucked in his lap. No one had noticed when he left early. What stung wasn't Cole's success, it was the assumption that Lucas didn't have any. He remembered one spring evening at age 11. Lucas had begged to attend the state biology camp, an elite summer program for kids obsessed with life sciences. His teacher had nominated him. He'd printed the flyer and carefully highlighted the application deadline. He brought it to the dinner table like it was a trophy. Margaret glanced at the page while sipping wine. It's expensive, she said gently. I could try for a scholarship, Lucas offered. Mr. Hall says I have a good chance. Richard barely looked up. What's the point? You're not going to be a doctor. I don't want to be a doctor, Lucas said softly. I want to study genes, maybe create therapies that... That's not a job, son. That's a fantasy. You want to waste a summer poking at frogs, Cole snorted. Might be the only time you touch anything alive. The table erupted in laughter. Margaret had smiled politely even as Lucas's face drained of color. Maybe next year, sweetheart, he never replied. Dinner tables were minefields after that. Lucas learned to eat quickly, speak little, and vanish as soon as plates were cleared. He memorized the creaks in the floorboards to avoid attention. He grew into silence like it was armor. But even silence couldn't shield him from comparison. You should take notes from your brother, Richard would say. Cole's got drive. Cole has presence, Margaret added once. You need to learn to hold space, Lucas. He wanted to scream, I don't want to hold space. I want to understand space. I want to know how cells repair themselves. I want to ask questions no one has answered yet. But he didn't scream. He nodded, always nodded. At school, he found solace in science labs and library corners. His teachers saw him, really saw him. One Mrs. Trent once pulled him aside in 9th grade and whispered, Lucas, you have a mind that could shift paradigms. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. He'd smiled the whole bus ride home that day, but at dinner when he shared her words, Richard had smirked. Sounds like she wants you to end up broke and tenured. Margaret hadn't defended him. Lucas stopped telling them things after that. He watched the way Margaret looked at Cole with pride, yes, but also a subtle dependence. She mirrored Richard's opinions, and though she'd once defended Lucas as a child by his teens, she'd become quieter, more agreeable. Lucas sometimes wondered if she resented him for not making things easier. As Cole's business grew and made headlines, family conversations became centered on IPOs, mergers, and vacation homes. Lucas would sit quietly nodding while they speculated about the market and golfed in Scottsdale. Once during Thanksgiving, Margaret said maybe Cole can help you get a job with one of his startups. You'd be great with data entry. Lucas smiled. Thanks, Mom. I'm good. The truth was, even then he was deep into grad school working in a lab that would soon publish a paper on gene editing applications in oncology. But he never brought it up. He had learned the less they knew, the less it hurt. But his dreams hadn't dimmed. In the solitude of dorm rooms, he dissected genomes the way others dissected novels. He read research papers instead of Reddit. He took midnight walks not to clear his mind, but to fill it. He dreamed of creating something that could heal, something that mattered, not for attention, not even for approval, just to prove to himself that he could. And in those years of absence, while the family grouped in Christmas photos without him, while Cole climbed Forbes lists, Lucas built a world they'd never touched. He still remembered one night in particular, winter in Boston, snow thick on the window panes of his lab. He'd stayed up 48 hours running trials. When the results came in proof that his CRISPR variant had outperformed controls by 42%, he sat alone staring at the screen. There were no champagne corks, no cheers, just quiet triumph. In that moment, Lucas realized some victories come wrapped not in noise but in sense. And that's okay, because some dreams are too sacred for applause. At 22, Lucas left the Brennan house with nothing but a duffel bag and a full-ride scholarship. No one cried. No one offered to help pack. Richard had simply muttered, "You'll be back once you realize the real world doesn't run on microscopes." But Lucas didn't look back. He boarded a bus bound for Boston, where his graduate program in molecular biology awaited. It wasn't just a relocation. It was an exodus. The dorm they gave him was cold and smelled faintly of mildew, but it was his. For the first time, no one interrupted his thoughts. No one criticized his books. No one questioned his dreams. He taped a printout of Watson and Crick's double helix on the wall beside his bed. His sanctuary. The scholarship covered tuition and a modest meal plan. But textbooks were expensive. Lab fees piled up. So Lucas worked nights stacking boxes at a biotech supply warehouse. From 7 p.m. to 1 a.m., then waking at 6 to run enzyme trials. He ate granola bars for dinner. He learned how to make coffee last through a 12-hour lab shift. No one in his family ever called to ask how he was doing. Thanksgiving came and went. Christmas passed. Silence from Denver. Lucas stopped checking his phone for missed call. One snowy night in February, while sketching out a cellular regeneration model on the whiteboard at the library, a voice interrupted. "You know that's not going to work without accounting for Cas9 drift, right?" Lucas turned surprised. The voice belonged to a tall guy with unruly curls, a thick accent. Argentinian, maybe. He introduced himself as Ray Martinez, a fellow grad student specializing in bioinformatics. They argued about Cas9 that night until 3 a.m. Then they got coffee. Ray was the first person Lucas had met who didn't just understand his obsession with molecular design, but shared it. While others treated his ideas like curiosities, Ray treated them like currency. Their friendship formed in labs over pizza boxes and spilled reagents. Ray was loud where Lucas was quiet, bold where Lucas was cautious. But in code and cellular models, they danced in sync. By their second year, they began sketching ideas for a startup. Not the kind that made flashy gadgets, but one that quietly revolutionized how immune response could be genetically modified for targeted therapies. They called it BioIntegra. Lucas didn't tell his parents. When it came time to register the company, Ray insisted Lucas be the public founder. But Lucas refused. "I want to build this," he said, "but I don't want my name on anything." Ray blinked. "Why not? You're the one designing 70% of the model." Lucas hesitated. "Because if I fail, it'll be my failure. And if I succeed, I want it to be on my terms. No headlines, no applause." He didn't say the rest, that if the Brennans ever heard about BioIntegra, he didn't want them thinking it had anything to do with them. He didn't want Cole claiming inspiration or his father minimizing the science as a lucky gamble. Ray shrugged. "All right, I'll be the front man. But if this takes off, you better get used to being known." Lucas smiled. "I'll cross that bridge if we ever build it." They worked out of a windowless lab space near Cambridge, funded by grants and Ray's uncanny charm with investors. Lucas coded until his wrists ached. He tested proteins until his vision blurred. There were nights he slept on the lab floor with a sweatshirt for a pillow. Still, he never felt more awake. What they were building mattered. One protein at a time, one sequence at a time. Lucas felt his purpose click into place, not in spite of his family, but apart from them. One night, after a particularly grueling setback, an entire sequence batch ruined due to a corrupted substrate. Lucas sat alone in the break room, elbows on knees, staring at his calloused hands. He could hear Richard's voice in his head. "It's not a real job, but the proof was in the blood samples, in the success rate charts, in the way oncologists were beginning to respond to their early data with cautious excitement." Lucas leaned back, eyes burning, and whispered to no one, "I don't need to prove anything to them. I just need to prove to myself that I am enough." In that moment, he realized this was no longer about rebellion. It wasn't even about them. It was about reclaiming his own reflection, about looking in the mirror and finally recognizing the man staring back, not as the brother, not the son, but as the builder of something real. A scientist, a founder, a man who had chosen his path not despite rejection, but because of it. Success, when it finally came, didn't arrive with fireworks. It came in an email. Lucas was in the lab, hunched over a centrifuge, earbuds in, humming faintly to a Bach concerto. His hands moved automatically, pipette sample spin, until Ray burst through the door, grinning like a man who'd just won the lottery. "You need to check your inbox." Lucas raised an eyebrow but obeyed. The subject line read, "Proposal accepted. Mayo Clinic partnership." He blinked. Ray was already pasting behind him. "They're in. They want to license our LMX9 platform. 7-figure buy-in. Front-end royalties." "This is it, man." Lucas stared at the screen. The words didn't immediately register. But then something in him loosened like a knot, untangling deep in his chest. He didn't jump. He didn't shout. Instead, he leaned back, hands in his lap, and let the silence wash over him. He remembered every granola bar dinner, every time he ran trial after trial through tears and caffeine. Every voice that told him it wouldn't work. They had been wrong. BioIntegra's LMX9 protein regulator was set to be integrated into next-generation oncology treatments. The emails began flooding in research institutions, private hospitals, pharmaceutical giants. The scientific community was watching, and so was the media. Requests for interviews came almost weekly. TechCrunch, Nature, The Atlantic. Ray did most of the talking. Lucas declined almost every time. He didn't want to be a face, he wanted to remain the mind behind the curtain. Still, his name began to appear in citations and acknowledgments and footnotes that carried weight. One article referred to him as the silent architect of modern immunotherapy. Lucas folded that one and tucked it in a drawer. By the third year of the partnership, BioIntegra had tripled in value. Ray moved into a penthouse overlooking Boston Harbor. Lucas instead searched for something quieter. He bought a property in Hillcrest, an old villa perched on a hill with panoramic views of pine forests and lakes. It had once belonged to a retired painter, and the rooms still smelled faintly of oil and turpentine. Lucas renovated it minimally, preserving the quirks, the uneven stone floor, the sun-bleached shutters, the garden full of rosemary and lilac. It wasn't just a house, it was a boundary. No more dorm walls, no more sleeping under fluorescent lights. This was space to breathe. He furnished it with simplicity, bookshelves, long tables, art from local students. In the evenings, he sat by the fireplace reading scientific papers. There was no television, no news. But silence wasn't lonely. One evening, he found himself sorting through old boxes he hadn't opened in years. Photos, yearbooks, torn journals from high school. At the bottom of one box, a framed photograph the Brennan family taken just before Cole left for college. Richard with his hand on Cole's shoulder. Margaret smiling tightly, Lucas standing just slightly off-center as if unsure he belonged in the frame. Lucas stared at the photo for a long time. He didn't feel anger. He felt distance, a wide ocean between the boy in that photo and the man he had become. Still something stirred, not vengeance, not a need to prove, but clarity. He thought of the villa, of the way the light hit the garden at noon, the fireplace that now warmed his nights, the library shelves full of things he'd built not for show, but for self. He looked back at the photo. Maybe they would never see him clearly, maybe they would never understand what he'd built, but maybe they should at least see it. He took the frame, wiped the dust from the glass, and whispered, "They won't define me anymore, but they will witness me." That night, Lucas opened his laptop and began drafting invitations. A housewarming party, small, curated, family only. He didn't plan a speech. He didn't plan a reveal, just an invitation to his world. The invitations were sent on thick, cream-colored cardstock, simple, elegant, with no return address. The font was clean, almost understated. Just a time, a date, and a location: Hillcrest. No mention of the host's name, no occasion. Just "you're invited." An evening at the villa. A new beginning. 3 days later, Lucas received the first reply. Sophie texted, "Wait, is this your house? Or are you dating a billionaire and forgot to mention it?" He replied with a smile emoji. Then came the call from Margaret. She didn't start with a greeting. "So, this invitation. Whose house is it, Lucas?" He kept his tone even. "It's mine." Silence on the other end. "Yours?" "Yes." A pause. "Is it a rental? Some kind of resort?" "It's where I live now," Lucas said simply. "Where I plan to stay." Margaret exhaled, slow and careful. "Your friend. She must be very successful." Lucas smiled faintly. "The house is mine, Mom." Another pause. "I see. She didn't, but she would." That evening, Cole called. No hellos. "So Hillcrest, you win the lottery?" Lucas let the sarcasm slide. I thought it'd be nice to host something for the family. Cole snorted. Right. And I'm the tooth fairy. I'm serious. Who's this woman you're hiding, Lucas? Because let me tell you, that kind of property isn't grad student cute. That's serious money. Like hedge fund wife kind of money. Lucas said nothing for a moment. Then just come to the party, Cole. Cole laughed. I will. I wouldn't miss this circus. Lucas hung up before the conversation could sour further. As the date approached, he didn't plan a presentation. No dramatic reveals, he didn't rehearse speeches. The house was the message. The man who lived in it was the proof. Still, something unsettled him as the day drew near. He spent the night before the event walking the empty halls of the villa. The air was still. Outside, pine trees danced gently under the moonlight. The stone floors echoed beneath his steps. He stood in the center of the living room, the heart of the house. The fire was unlit. The walls wore their silence like silk. Lucas looked around, trying to see the space through their eyes. Would they think it ostentatious? Would they assume someone else built it for him? Would they laugh? He didn't care, or at least he told himself he didn't. But beneath that, something lingered. Not revenge, not the burning satisfaction of proving them wrong. It was something quieter, something closer to longing. He didn't want applause, he wanted clarity. He wanted to cleanse himself of the years he'd spent shrinking. He whispered to the stillness, "This isn't about them seeing what I've done. It's about me no longer hiding who I've become." He touched the edge of the marble fireplace, trailing his fingers along the cool stone. It had taken him years to build this life brick by brick in silence, in exile. And now in this house he had filled with purpose and peace, he would stand, not as the forgotten son, but as the man who had survived. Not out of bitterness, out of wholeness. As the clock chimed midnight, Lucas exhaled and turned off the lights. Tomorrow they would arrive, and for the first time they would have to look at him not through the lens of memory or mockery, but in full present light. The driveway wound like a ribbon through to tall pines, each branch dipped in late spring light. At the end stood the Villa Hillcrest in all its quiet grandeur. Cream-colored stone-arched windows, ivy curling like cursive along the walls. A stillness hung in the air, elegant and almost holy. Margaret was the first to speak as the family stepped out of their car. "My goodness," she whispered. "Is this a resort?" Sophie glanced at her mother, eyes wide. "I thought Lucas said this was his place." Cole let out a low whistle, adjusting his cufflinks. "Damn. Either she's a trust fund baby or she's hiding gold bars in the basement." He turned to Lucas, who waited calmly at the entrance, wearing a dark blazer and no tie. "Tell me, little brother, what's the buy-in for a place like this?" Lucas smiled without showing teeth. "You'll find out soon enough." The entryway opened into a high-ceilinged foyer, sunlight spilling through skylights onto polished stone. A soft classical melody floated in the background, Debussy. If Margaret's ears served her right, as they stepped inside, Cole couldn't resist. "So where is she, this mysterious girlfriend/sugar mama?" Lucas simply gestured down the hall. "Come in, let me show you the living room." They followed, murmuring appreciations, pausing at sculptures and curated photography along the walls. Cole was already doing mental math. The room opened wide into a grand yet understated lounge lined with books, warm-toned furniture, and tall windows overlooking a garden in full bloom. And there, in the very center of the room, stood a single easel. Atop it, a mounted poster-sized reprint of the cover of Nature magazine. The title in bold, Lucas Brennan, the brain behind Biointegra's cancer breakthrough. Below, a full-color photograph of Lucas, arms crossed in a lab coat, eyes focused, standing before a complex array of molecular diagrams. Sophie gasped. Margaret dropped her handbag. Cole stared, blinked, then stared again. Is this a joke? Lucas moved to stand beside the display, calm as the room fell into stunned silence. It's not a joke, he said. This is my home, and this, he nodded to the magazine, is the life I've built. Cole stepped forward, still processing. But Biointegra. That's your company. You're that Lucas Brennan. Lucas looked him in the eye. I've always been that Lucas Brennan. You just weren't looking. Margaret seemed breathless. But why didn't you tell us? Because for years, Lucas said gently, I didn't think you'd want to know. They all stood still as if waiting for someone else to speak. No one did. Lucas stepped closer to the poster, his voice low but resonant. This is my house, and it was built not just with grants or success, but with every year I spent being overlooked, every dinner where I sat in silence, every time I was told my dreams weren't real. This isn't revenge, it's resurrection. He turned to them, no malice in his eyes, only clarity. I invited you here not to impress you, not to flaunt what I've made, but to show you that I didn't disappear. I didn't fade out. I became. The room remained suspended in silence, as if the very walls were listening. Cole looked lost for once, stripped of his usual armor of sarcasm. Margaret touched her necklace as if searching for the right words. But Lucas didn't wait for them. He moved to pour wine, offering glasses with practiced ease. Make yourselves comfortable, he said almost casually. Dinner will be ready shortly. No one knew what to say, but for the first time in his life, Lucas didn't need them to. It didn't take long after the initial shock for the tension to build. After drinks were served and the family had wandered into the garden, the hum of conversation returned, but it was tight, uncertain. Sophie stayed close to the hors d'oeuvres. Margaret alternated between admiration and awkward silences. Richard walked the perimeter, hands in pockets, saying little, but Cole simmered. It was just past sunset when he cornered Lucas in the study, a room lined with floor-to-ceiling books and soft lighting. He shut the door with a quiet thud. You set this up, he said flatly. All of it. Lucas didn't look up from pouring himself a glass of water. Set what up? This, Cole hissed. The house, the magazine, the perfect hosting act. You wanted to humiliate us. Lucas took a sip, then met his brother's eyes. Calm, steady. No, Cole. I wanted to show you the truth. Cole laughed bitterly. The truth that you're some genius we never saw coming. That you've been building an empire while we thought you were living in a shoebox. Lucas didn't flinch. I was never hiding, Cole. You were never looking. Cole ran a hand through his hair. You could have told us. I did, Lucas said, voice soft but clear. Not in words, maybe, but I tried. And when I realized no one cared to ask, I stopped. There was a pause, heavy, suspended. Cole crossed his arms. You embarrassed Dad. Mom looked like she was going to faint. Lucas tilted his head. Did I, or did the truth just make them uncomfortable? Same thing. No, Lucas replied. Not at all. I didn't call them names. I didn't insult your choices. I just stepped into the space I've built for myself. And that space is bigger than what you thought I was allowed. Cole looked at him for a long time. Beneath the bravado, there was something else. Something bordering on shame. Before he could respond, the door opened. Richard stepped inside slower than usual, hands behind his back. I'm not interrupting, am I? He asked. Neither brother spoke. I wanted a moment with you, Lucas. Richard said, voice uncharacteristically quiet. If that's all right. Cole lingered, then slipped out, pulling the door shut behind him. Lucas stood still. Richard walked over to the desk and rested his hand on it, eyes not quite meeting his son's. I'll be honest, he said. When I saw that magazine, I thought maybe someone made a mistake. Lucas said nothing. But I read the article, Richard continued. Start to finish. twice. Lucas waited. I always thought you were smart. But this, what you've built, he paused. It's more than smart. It's extraordinary. Lucas nodded slowly. Thank you. I should have said something like that a long time ago. Richard admitted, rubbing his temples. I should have listened when you tried to tell us who you were. Lucas stepped forward, folding his arms gently across his chest. I don't need an apology, Dad. I'm not here for that. I know, Richard said, but I'm saying it anyway. I was wrong about what mattered, about who mattered. Lucas felt a strange tightness in his chest, not pain, but release. He took a deep breath. I don't blame you, he said. Not anymore. Richard looked at him, eyes misting. Then what do you want? Lucas paused. I want to stop pretending, he said. Pretending that I'm okay with being the shadow. That I accept the version of me this family painted. I've played that role for so long I nearly forgot I could leave the stage. He stepped past his father, gesturing to the walls, the shelves, the quiet dignity of the space. This is my life now, not because I needed to prove you wrong, but because I needed to be right with myself. Richard nodded slowly. I see that now. Lucas gave a small smile. I hope so. The phone rang 2 days after the party. Lucas saw the name before he answered. Margaret. He hesitated, thumb hovering over the screen, then slowly he picked up. There was a pause on the other end. A breath. Then her voice shaky, unguarded. I don't know where to begin. Lucas said nothing. I didn't sleep, she continued, voice brittle. I kept seeing your face, the house, that magazine cover. Still Lucas remained silent. You must think we're monsters, she said. But everything we did, pushing you, questioning you, it was because we were scared. We didn't want you to get hurt. Lucas finally spoke, his voice low. You didn't want me to fail, yes, she said, almost desperate. Exactly. He paused again. But you never prepared yourself for the possibility that I might succeed. She choked on the other end. We didn't know how to understand you. I didn't need you to understand. Lucas replied gently. I just needed you to care. A soft sob crackled through the line. I'm so sorry, Lucas, she whispered. We were just trying to protect you. Lucas sat down, the phone cradled to his ear. I know, Mom. Another pause, the sound of her catching her breath. You're not angry? He closed his eyes. No, he said. I'm not angry. And it was true. He wasn't. He wasn't bitter or resentful. He wasn't interested in guilt. What he felt was older, deeper, like a river running under a thawing surface, cold but moving. He didn't want payback. He wanted peace. They talked for a few more minutes, mostly in circles. Then the call ended, gentle and uncertain. He didn't expect another one. That night, as Lucas sat reading in the garden, his phone buzzed again. A message from Sophie. I don't think I said this at the party, but I'm proud of you. I always have been. Lucas smiled. I know, he replied. And he did. Sophie had been the quiet exception. The one who noticed when he skipped family holidays, who sent him messages on birthdays even when the rest forgot. She didn't take sides, but she never looked away either. In the days that followed, Lucas returned to his quiet routines, morning walks in the forest, research calls with Biointegra mentoring interns online. But something had shifted. Not outside, inside. Forgiveness, he realized, was not a door you opened and walked back through. It was a field you stepped into alone and chose to plant something new. He didn't need reconciliation. He didn't need a restored dinner table. He didn't need Cole to suddenly become a brother or his parents to rewrite history. He just needed to stop carrying the weight of what wasn't his to fix. One evening he sat down with a legal notepad and began writing. A scholarship. Small at first, targeted to young students interested in cellular biology but lacking support. He named it the Margaret Brennan Fund for Future Scientists. He didn't tell her, he didn't plan to. It wasn't for recognition, it was for closure. A quiet act of healing offered not to erase the past but to end its echo. As he mailed the documents and finalized the endowment, Lucas felt something lift. Not joy, not triumph, but lightness. A chapter finally closed, and in its place space to begin again. Lucas woke each day before the sun rose. The mornings at Hillcrest were cool and quiet, the air laced with pine and dew. He had come to love the solitude not as escape, but as space, the kind of space that didn't demand explanation or validation. It simply allowed him to be. His routine was simple. Tea on the back terrace, a walk through the trails that curved behind the house. Sometimes he read, sometimes he just listened to the wind in the branches, to birdsong weaving between rays of soft light. It was a life far from the sterile corridors of corporate biotech, far from boardrooms and strategy calls. But it was not a retreat. It was an arrival. Lucas still worked selectively. He advised young startups, mentored students through online platforms, reviewed research proposals for ethical grants. But the heart of his days beat slower now, more intentionally. Every month, a group of scholarship recipients came to visit. Bright-eyed undergrads, recent grads, first-generation scientists who stepped into his house like it was a palace. Lucas greeted them in jeans and an old sweater, poured them lemonade, and listened more than he spoke. They called him Dr. Brennan, though he never asked them to. Some of them brought notebooks, others just questions, most brought gratitude. And in their eyes he saw pieces of the boy he once was, the boy who had wondered if he belonged, if anyone would ever see what he had to give. He didn't tell them much about the past. He didn't have to. They saw the path. They saw what could be built from silence. After one such visit, Lucas stood alone in the garden watching them drive away down the winding hill. He felt no pride, only peace. He tended his garden. He cooked his own meals. He hosted small dinners with local artists and scientists, curated honest conversations about the future of knowledge, of kindness, of human understanding. One spring evening, he hosted a book club of strangers. A quiet professor, a former nurse, a retiree who loved astronomy. They talked about the mind as a landscape. Lucas didn't mention science until the end. Even then he offered thoughts gently, as if folding paper. This was his real breakthrough. Not a drug, not a patent, but a life, free of performing. A few weeks later, an email arrived. He saw the subject line while sorting his inbox over breakfast. Forbes. Congratulations, you've made the list. He clicked it open. Top 50 Most Influential Minds in Science, 2025 edition. There was a brief biography, a headshot he didn't remember taking, a quote from a former student, mentions of BioIntegra, of course, of the scholarship, of the fact that Lucas Brennan had become, in quiet defiance of the odds, a name that mattered. He read the whole thing once. Then he closed the laptop. He didn't forward it to anyone. He didn't frame it. He didn't call Ray or Sophie or anyone else. Instead, he stepped outside. The sun was just rising over the ridge, casting gold across the lake below. He stood there a long moment, mug warm in his hands, the earth still cool beneath his feet. He thought of everything it took to arrive here, the years spent not fighting back but building forward. The difference between proving something to the world and becoming someone for yourself. He smiled, not because the world had finally noticed him, but because long before it did, he had already noticed himself. And this time he didn't look away. News came quietly. Cole's real estate venture had failed investors, gone lawsuits, looming headlines clipped with words like reckless and collapse. Margaret called Lucas again, voice tentative. Worried about Cole, she said. We don't know how to help. He's not himself. Lucas listened. He nodded. He offered no advice, no blame, just a silence that understood. He felt no glee, no satisfaction, just stillness, the kind that comes after a storm. That week he received a letter from Sophie, handwritten. You were always the strong one, she wrote, even when no one saw it. Maybe especially then. Lucas folded the letter, tucked it in the drawer where he kept things that reminded him of truth. Life moved on. He watched the seasons change from the large windows of Hillcrest, watched birds return, leaves turn snow, settle in hushed patterns across the hills. He welcomed silence as an old friend, now no longer a void but a canvas. He sometimes walked past old photos, childhood snapshots, family gatherings, forgotten birthdays. The images didn't sting like they once had. They just existed, like artifacts from a different life, a different boy. He found himself speaking at conferences again, less about science, more about story. The human story behind the research, rooms filled with young minds, old doubts, and silent applause. Afterward, people would approach him not to admire his work, but to thank him for his honesty. One morning, he taught a workshop on ethical research to a class of undergrads. One young man stayed behind, awkward and earnest. Dr. Brennan, he said, how did you know you were enough? Lucas paused, then said, I didn't. Not always, but I learned that waiting for others to believe it keeps you locked out of your own life. The student nodded, quietly changed. Later that week, Lucas received an invitation. His alma mater wanted him to give the commencement address. It was the same university where his request to attend a science camp was once denied. He hesitated, then said yes. At the ceremony, he stood before rows of graduates in caps and gowns. His speech wasn't filled with quotes or achievements. It was filled with pauses, with moments of vulnerability. I'm not here because I succeeded, he said. I'm here because I stayed. Through silence, through doubt, and because I chose not to become bitter when no one clapped. In the front row, a woman dabbed her eyes. He didn't know if it was his mother. He didn't need to. That evening, Lucas returned to his desk. The house was quiet except for a breeze slipping through the open window. He took out a sheet of paper, uncapped his fountain pen, and began to write. Dear 18-year-old me, you were scared. You didn't say it out loud, but you were. Scared that the silence would last forever, that your quiet curiosity would never mean anything, that you were just strange, out of place. You waited for someone to say, I see you, but no one did. Not for a long time, but you waited well. And when no one showed up, you became the person you needed. You built a life out of wonder. You turned loneliness into clarity. You never let the absence of applause stop your music. And now I get to live that music, in peace, in purpose. You lived right, not because they finally saw your worth, but because you never stopped believing in it yourself. This letter isn't about closure. It's about recognition. You didn't need to win. You needed to be true, and you were, and that made all the difference. He signed the letter, folded it, placed it in an envelope addressed only to the past. Then he stepped outside. The stars were out, quiet, ancient, endless. Lucas lifted his face to the sky, the soft hush of the earth below him. And he smiled. Nothing left to prove, only everything left to live. And somewhere in that starlit hush, he imagined his younger self reading the letter, not with awe, but with relief, because someone finally had written back, because someone himself had always believed he was worth the story. Because even when the world was silent, he never stopped listening to the voice that mattered most, his own.